Welcome to Keeping the World Company on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about what will the new Syria look like? What are the chances that it will be an enlightened democracy? Our co-host for the show is Tim Apicella. Our esteemed guests for the show are Gene Rosenfeld, independent scholar, and Manfred Henningsen, emeritus professor, political philosophy, UH Manoa. Welcome to the show, you all. Let me start with you, Tim. Um, what is the current status? Is it settled down in Syria? Everybody was jubilant the other day. Are they still jubilant, or is that wearing off?
Yes, it's not jubilant. It's the horror show is unfolding. The prisons are being opened up in Damascus and in the outskirts of Damascus, and the horror show of the torture and the murdering of hundreds of thousands of Syrians is now unfolding before the media and, of course, for those in the country itself.
What does it tell us? I mean, people must be pretty angry when they go into prisons and find this evidence that they didn't know about of all these atrocities. Do you see among them, do you see on the TV reports that they are angry? We know they are shocked. We know they are jubilant about getting rid of Assad, but are they angry?
I would think they would be. I can't speak for them because I'm not there and I haven't witnessed it. But when you discover something like this, it actually has a unifying effect. They may be separated by religious sects or tribal identities, but I think when you see something like this happen to your own fellow countrymen, there has to be some sort of unifying effect that starts to sweep over. I think it helps the existing or the current leader to try to unify based on the horrors of the Assad regime and his father. This has gone on for so many years that it has to be a breath of fresh air. And that alone, I don't know if it's jubilant. Maybe it's a sense of relief. But now they have to deal with the horrors and rebuild all these cities, Aleppo, and all these cities that have been decimated, similar to what Ukraine will have to experience in the future. And there's a task, and it's going to, exact a heavy price on every person in that country. So yes, there's relief, there's happiness, but I think it's tempered and I think it's short term.
Gene, you're into social psychology. Um, Now, the group that kind of took over from city to city and got to Damascus and took over the country was HTS. But HTS is not the only group involved. And when you look closer, when we all see closer, we see the one guy who is running HTS, and he seems reasonable, although he's got a background in Al Qaeda and ISIS. Um, do you think that in the circumstances, the jubilation will continue? Will these groups get along? Will HTS be the leadership group, or will it fragment?
Well, we can only look at past examples of sudden takeovers and revolutions after civil wars. One example that comes to mind is Cuba. Those of us who were around when Fidel Castro took over in Havana recall that he presented himself as a moderate initially, and he was greeted by the United States initially. And then he reverted to type as a communist and made Cuba a satellite of the Soviet Union. Even after the Soviet Union fell, he and his successor, his brother, remained allied to Russia. And I'm not saying that's going to happen in Syria, but here what we have is a forced unity of militia groups on the very extreme end of the spectrum, who were designated as terrorists by the United States, who came out of ISIS and Al Qaeda, who basically were Salafi jihadists, as Fawaz Gerges, the great expert on this part of the world in Britain, has said. They were extremists, and the military head gave a reasonable interview the other day, just like Castro did when he took over. But the president is presumably there only as a caretaker for 1 year. He's supposed to relinquish control on March 1st, 2025. Mohammed al-Bashir, he was the head of HTS, which stands for the Office or Organization for the Liberation of Lebanon. It still retains a jihadist ideology. Whether or not it becomes a jihadist uh, in practice, in other words, if it conducts purges, how it attempts to unify, does it reinstate draconian measures of control? What is its attitude toward the other states that are trying to create a moderate posture in the Middle East, the union of Sunni states? How will it react to the Sunni states? How will the Sunnis and the Shias in Syria get along? The Shias are a minority, but their government, the two dictators, have been in charge, and Iran has actually guaranteed the unity of Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad for many, many years, since the 1990s. And now Iran is out of the picture. So will the Shias then suffer retribution by the Sunnis, already trying to install control in the smaller cities and towns? Is difficult. The situation is chaotic, but still, people in the Middle East who escaped Syria are returning in droves right now. Most of all, they want to look for their missing relatives.
This regression you talked about is very interesting because he comes in there, and as you said, he was very reasonable in the interview. He said he would step down from power in March. That is something. And he, his comments suggested he was an enlightened person, and ultimately they would go for a kind of popular democracy, and they would stop the violence and bring people together. That was really something. And I said to myself, "Gee whiz, that surprises me." But the regression, the process of the regression you talked about, what are the influences that he is subject to? Is it like he's sitting with the other, more activist, groups, and they are demanding that he regress? Or is it something internal where he says, well, I got to say this, and I'll say this for the world, for the propaganda, but soon enough, I got to get back to my roots. And if there are people trying to convince him to regress, who are they?
Well, it depends. This was a military alliance to overthrow the government at a moment of weakness for Iran as a result of the Gaza war. And whether this military alliance can also create a union of political alliance among the various factions that carry arms in Syria is yet to be seen. So there has to be a transition from the alliance in a military sense to the alliance in a political sense. And then they have to win the hearts and minds of the people, unless they're going to regress to a dictatorship.
Yeah, this is so interesting, and you wonder. And there's press, there's Western press now in Syria reporting back to us with that interview, for example, but a lot more about the prison, as Tim was talking. This is reaching not only the people in Western Europe and the U.S., it's reaching the people in Syria, and they can see what's happening. So the press is very important, I think, to bring people together. And if they do it right, I think the press will have a positive effect on all that. But the question is, and this is a hard one, Gene, how long is this all going to take to settle down one way or the other? Are we talking about March as a due date here? Or is this going to go on and on before it actually comes to rest?
It depends on whose timeline you are looking at. For example, as long as Iran remains uninvolved with Syria, Syria has a greater opportunity to consolidate forces and to create a sense of order. Then it depends on the ideology that the regime depends upon. Will it be like the Taliban in Afghanistan, to which it is ideologically related? Or will it find common cause with the moderate forces on the Arabian Peninsula and the Sunnis? We don't know that yet. Then there's the issue of the Kurds in the north. The US just brokered a ceasefire between the Kurds who retreated from a city there, who have been actually doing a lot of things that the US likes. And we have 900 advisors close by that we want to protect with the Kurds, and Turkey, which is very adamant about sweeping the Kurds back into their little enclave north of Syria and Iraq, so that they will not be a claimant to land in Turkey, which is close by the area they occupy in Syria. So there are all these influences going on, and there are just too many factors. We don't have enough data. It could resolve quickly, as it did in Afghanistan, and people could coalesce militarily, politically, spiritually, or the chaos could be overwhelmed by outside forces such as Iran or the United States or Israel, which is now taking and neutralizing land in southern Syria to protect its own borders. So we don't know how these forces are going to play out yet. We can just watch them.
You know, Manfred, one of the reasons that Assad was there and the Assad family held power for so long was because they had support from outside of Syria. They had Russia, to a certain extent, they had Turkey, they had Iran for sure. And these guys helped them stay in power. They were foreign influences to Syria, but they were not positive influences at all. And they permitted Assad to do the atrocious things that he did. And right now, it appears that none of these outside influences really trust this revolution. I mean, Russia certainly is at risk of losing its naval base. I think it is losing its naval base as we speak. Turkey doesn't trust, the rebels. Iran is worried sick that its connection to Hezbollah has been torn up because Syria is right in the middle. And Israel doesn't trust them either and is destroying military operations and equipment and attacking from Golan Heights. So none of these groups seem to be looking to a sort of common purpose here to bring people together, and the U.S. too, by the way. The U.S., by its actions, by Joe Biden's action, doesn't look like it trusts this rebellion. All the major players who allowed this to happen for so many years are demonstrating a lack of trust. And none of them are actively involved in consulting and consorting and trying to counsel the rebels to bring things together. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that. And I wonder what your thoughts are about Western Europe's reaction, because this is changing. It hasn't finished, as Gene said, it hasn't finished changing the Middle East, but it certainly will have profound effects. It will have profound changes as a result. Syria is right in the middle. So your thoughts about that, Manfred?
My tea leaves are as good as yours. I don't know what is going to happen over the next few weeks or months. But two things are interesting. It's loss of respect for Russia. Putin, got hit by this more than anybody else, but the Iranians as well. But there's one factor I think that one should also pay attention to. There are 6 million Syrians outside the country. 3.5 million are living in Turkey. And 1 million live in Germany. I mean, it's quite obvious that Erdogan wants to get rid of most of them. In Germany, Scholz has just said, it's too early to move back to Syria. Now, 200,000 of these 1 million that moved to Germany after Angela Merkel invited them in 2015 have become German citizens. I don't know whether these 2 million who are working in Social Security taxpayers, whether they want to go back, but I think this exile community will play a major role also in consolidating whatever regime will come to power in Syria. At this point, I don't know whether we will see either the Cuban scenario that Jean was rightly referring to, or the Afghanistan situation. But I think the 6 million Syrians that have lived outside of Syria for quite some time, but have family connections in Syria. So it's not that we are completely cut off. They will have also an impact because of their influential connections in the countries, especially in Germany and Turkey, in which they are living today.
Manfred, a lot of them, not all of them, not 6 million for sure, have indicated they want to come back. Some are coming back right now as we speak. And my question to you is why? Do they feel that this is a peaceful, nutritious society? They want to, restore their lives and fortunes and homes and families in Syria? Or is it because they want to, you alluded to this, is it because they want to come back and participate in rebuilding Syria? Or is it a combination?
I think it's a combination, but I mean, most of them, I know that at least about reports about the million in Germany, have still connections with family and friends in Syria. They were not cut. So in that sense, you have very close ties, and they want, to return to the country of their birth. But I think, I mean, in Turkey, for example, I watched that when I was once in Istanbul. They were not very happy with their situation there, and the Turks were not all that happy either about having these numbers of refugees there. Now, Erdogan did a lot of keeping them in Turkey because he got money from the European Union, to do that. The European Union didn't want, all of these refugees flooding into Europe. I mean, in 2015, when Angela Merkel didn't close the German border, there was a lot of pressure from Orban because a lot of these Syrian refugees were in the railway station in Budapest. And many of them started to walk, on the railway tracks in direction of Germany. So in that sense, I think the situation, how much they have settled in Germany, the 200,000 that became German citizens, and the young, that have gotten degrees at the universities and going to school there, they may want to stay because I do not think you have you will have dual citizenship between Germany and Syria. I mean, you don't even have dual citizenship between Germany and Turkey.
I think that's a very good point, because they know, like we know, that Aleppo is in ruins and Homs is in ruins. And all the cities of Syria are in ruins. And all their institutions have been, first destroyed by Assad, and now they're not yet rebuilt. And I'm wondering if, for example, Germany, just to take it as an example, you speak of Germany and the Ukraine situation, where Ukraine has been largely destroyed. And there's all these architects, engineers, contractors, builders, and the like in Germany who could be deployed into Ukraine to rebuild it, because there's always an issue about who pays for that. But is that the same view, do you think, Manfred, in Western Europe, that when this is all settled down, Western Europe is going to roll up its sleeves and try to rebuild? And if it rebuilds, will that be the priority, or will Ukraine be the priority? And furthermore, people who may want to go back, this is your point, who may want to go back, they're going to say, are you kidding me? The place is a wreck. Why would I go back? There's too much damage and destruction there. I'll wait it out and see what Western Europe does to rebuild it. Your thoughts?
you have 2 million Ukrainian refugees living in Germany. So you have 1 million Syrians and 2 million Ukrainians. Both of them know about the destruction that has occurred in their countries, in the Ukraine and in Syria. But I think you should not underestimate the emotional attachment that a lot of people have to their home countries. I mean, even if they are not bio-nationalists, I mean, it's a kind of emotional, cultural attachment that didn't go away. And so for that reason, I think it may be stronger in the Ukrainian case. And as I said earlier, at one point in an earlier session, you will get an EU Marshall Plan for the Ukraine. Whether that will also become an issue for Syria, I don't know, because there, I think the Arab states, especially Saudi Arabia, will play a major role in the reconstruction if the regime that comes into power in Syria will allow that.
Let me go to Tim, because a couple hours ago we were talking about Elon Musk's efforts to cut the federal budget. He doesn't think we should spend money on anything, including Social Security. And the question here is, what does the U.S. do? Either A, to participate in this phase of the settlement of all these issues in Syria, and what does the U.S. do in terms of rebuilding Syria? Because, as I said, it's going to take a lot of money. Now, Biden went in there and he attacked military assets, but he is, generally a humane person, and under him, the U.S. would have a kinder, gentler view of participation. Under Trump has said so far, stay away, stay out, don't be involved. And when he said that, he's really saying it to everybody. He's saying it to the whole country here. He's saying it to his administration coming soon. And he's saying it to Western Europe, too. I don't want you to spend any money. Don't do anything. Let them work it out themselves without our help. So the role of the U.S., Tim, what is it? What should it be? What can it be?
What it is right now, of course, we supply foreign aid to many, many countries in the world. Now, compare that to previous statements from Donald Trump about whether or not that's a wise effort. When there's, as he uses, as a populist movement, there's people in America suffering, therefore America first should be a consideration versus foreign aid. So I think that is your pathway on where we're going to go on this issue. I don't think there'll be a lot of support for Syria from the United States. I think there'll be more support to Ukraine. And I don't know if it's to the extent of the old Marshall Plan to Germany, but I think it moves more in that direction, certainly, than it does Syria. I think the United States is going to tap on the shoulder of Saudi Arabia and say, hey, you have a role here, and you have resources in which to play that role. That's my personal feeling. I mean, as we said at the beginning of the show, I guess we're just going to have to wait to see how it all unravels. But there's a lot of MAGA supporters that feel that U.S. resources should not be dropped in Syria.
About the Marshall Plan, because Tim, when you said Marshall Plan in Germany, you have to remember the Marshall Plan, the priority went to Britain, the second was France, and the third was Germany.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Now,
appreciate that.
And I think one thing one should also remember when talking about the Marshall Plan, most of the money didn't leave the US because the Europeans bought American equipment. Mm-hmm. And I think that will happen if the EU should do something similar. So it will be, the industrial base of the EU that will be involved in the reconstruction of the Ukraine and of Syria.
I think that's right on the money, actually, Manfred, because when Trump thinks about it, he's going to realize that his friends, the contractors, the building supply people, the architects, the engineers, big capital concentrations can make a ton of money,
right,
in Ukraine and also in Syria. and it will be American money paid to American contractors, which is
Yes.
okay. That helps the American economy. So I think when he thinks about it, he's going to see this as transactional, a transaction that will help his oligarchical friends. Tim, do you agree?
No, and only because Donald Trump cares about his base, his MAGA base.
Yeah,
And I
that's
think,
true.
and I think this support, and I agree wholeheartedly. Right now, the military effort to supply Ukraine has helped American companies greatly. We don't know the specifics, but that's my best guess. I think Donald Trump is going to worry about how his MAGA supporters are going to perceive taking care of his oligarch friends versus the philosophy of America first.
Typically, historically, expatriate communities have played an outsized role in the financial health of their home countries. Syrians in Europe and the US and the Middle East who have some means, even modest means, will be contributing to their relatives in Syria. The current president, caretaker president in Syria, has said that they are in dire financial circumstances. The only currency they have is local, it's not world currency. They can't pay back their loans and they have no means of generating money, plus the fact that they were indebted to Iran, which they can't pay back actually, for oil. They don't have oil to sustain their infrastructure. So the role of the expatriate communities in the United States, in Germany, in Europe, is going to forge ahead right away. People may go back and visit, but they're not going to stay there if they don't have jobs and they don't have houses and they can't school their kids. But they certainly will be involved from abroad.
Well, I want to ask you about that. And we talk about, restoring some kind of civil society in Syria. But the fact is, Syria hasn't had a civil society with the institutions of a civil society in many, many, many years. Under a dictatorship, it just doesn't work that way, and they haven't attended to that at all. So it's not just a matter of rebuilding the buildings with the architects and the engineers and the contractors. It's a matter of local government. It's a matter of building institutions in a country that doesn't know about institutions. It's about arguably building a democracy in a country that has no idea about democracy. And how do we do that? And what is the US role there? What is the US role in the event that it begins to degenerate and there's violence? Do we send boots on the ground? Do we send advisors? Do we send lawyers who will write, statutes and regulations to build a civil society with civil society institutions? Jean?
First of all, don't expect Western democracy to evolve in Syria. Secondly, they have their own civilization and traditions. They have actually a great tradition to call upon. And the head of HTS said in his interview, do not expect us to develop the same institutions that you do in the West. Likewise, he also said, do not expect us to be terrorists. We're past that stage. We have gotten what we wanted. We want to institute a society that works for everyone. But that society is not going to look like a European country. And we shouldn't expect it.
Gene, we don't know what to expect. We don't know who's going to go left or right, up or down. And I want to ask Tim about that. If I asked you, how will this reach an enlightened democracy? That's almost a silly question. But let's ask the best result and the worst result. What is the best result that can be achieved with the cooperation and collaboration of these various contending factions in Syria? And what is the worst result that can be achieved for the lack of cooperation and collaboration in Syria?
Well, I think the number one, well, not the number one priority, but it's certainly a major priority is to keep the revenue coming into the country. Just before the show, I looked at some numbers, and as of September 2024, they bring in $10.3 billion in airplane parts. That's what they manufacture. They bring in $9.52 billion in refined petrol exports. They bring in $5.34 billion in car manufacturing, of all things. And crude petrol, they're bringing in $8.42 billion. So I don't know what their GMP is, but I know that this is real revenue. So the best you could hope for is that that revenue stream does not get interrupted, that it continues to come into the country. Because without that, you're not going to have financial abilities to repair anything. And then that's where chaos really starts to come into play. So you got to keep the revenue coming in. And then I agree with what Gene said is, let's not have the Arab Spring where pro-democracy was the hope of the day. Let their culture be what their culture is. And it may be autocratic in nature, but there's a difference between autocrats and abusive, horrific monster autocrats. Let's hope that it goes in that path of direction, that they're not looking for military conflict with its neighbors, that they just want to be left alone and peacefully rebuild their country. I think that would be the best hope they could have right now, and have a unification. Remember, there's many different tribal aspects to these countries, and it's hopefully you can unify behind a common theme, and that is rebuild Syria for Syrians.
Very good point. So, Manfred, you have all of these countries that have traditionally been influencing and manipulating Syria and helping a really bad dictator stay in power. And they, for their own reasons, did that over a long period of time. And they probably, for their own reasons, would like to continue to do that. So how do we keep them out? How do we realize the dream, that Tim was talking about, to leave them alone and to have Russia stay out, to have Turkey stay out, and certainly to have Iran stay out. Iran, would like to undermine them. We know that, and use them as a conduit for violence and terrorism. How do we keep them out? And what is the role of the U.S. in trying to keep them out? And what is the role of the U.S. in staying out itself?
And I don't mean it sarcastically, but one of the results of the reconstruction of Germany after World War II was that it was occupied by the victorious powers. And there were two models of reconstruction, the Soviet and the Western, led by the Americans, the British, and the French. So whatever retrograde fascist forces were slumbering there, and there were a lot, they would not have been able, of coming back to power because the three Western powers and their troops that were stationed there kept that from happening. Now, we cannot do anything like that in Syria. So it has to be the Syrian self respect. And, since they have had these terrible experiences with authoritarian regimes, and 6 million have left the country, whether all of them will or want to come back is another question. But I think the expatriates may have an influence in that reconstruction, in the way they are informing Western powers, especially European powers, because that's where they went into exile, to prevent the kind of falling back into an authoritarian Islamist regime.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good point. They learned something while they were away. They learned how a civil society works. And they probably would be able to bring those lessons back to Syria and create a civil society, or at least go a certain distance to create a civil society. Gene, we have you say that there's a great culture in the Middle East. I'm not sure I agree with that. It seems to be violent and terror driven so much of the time, where it might have been a great culture a couple hundred years ago. Right now, it just doesn't seem that way. And and the West has to sort of take care of it and to babysit it somehow. And the question I put to you is: we live in a global world. We live in a world where every country counts, or should count. How do we make Syria, however it evolves and after this rebellion, how do we make Syria a member of the family of nations? Can it make constructive contributions, or should we give up?
I think we should first look to our own house and decide not to be paternalistic. Not only that, but the current mode in the United States among all people, no matter what their political persuasion, is to stay out of foreign wars. And Biden really followed that dictum by retreating from Afghanistan. That is the general feeling today. So, what does that mean in terms of countries like Syria? They have a choice. They will either fall into the growing, unfortunately, growing small list of states that have come apart: Libya and Yemen, Lebanon now. The big player in the Middle East, quite frankly, right now, in terms of power, is Israel. What will Israel do? How will it regard Syria? First, Syria has to rebuild itself, then it has to integrate into the Middle East. Turkey is the hegemon right now in the region, wants to be. It does want to keep Russia out, and it's been playing a dual game with Russia. It's not going to take on Russia, but it is going to try and contain Russia. Iran, it depends on what happens with Russia, whether or not Iran is going to be able to survive the imminent demise of its Ayatollah Khamenei, because he's 86 years old, and in where he lives, that's very old. Maybe not here, but there it is. And so the question is, what does the future hold? Is the Middle East going to embrace modernism and technology, but retain its very proud traditions of Muslim institutions and scholarship? There are many schools of scholarship. There have been very successful regimes that have been Islamic regimes that have enabled other diverse groups of people to live peacefully within them. Currently, that's not true because of the jihadist technology and theology that has arisen and is dependent on bombs rather than building. So we can't judge Islam in general by the terrorists we've had to deal with since 9/11. We have to look at their very long history of tolerance and civilization. They have actually their own system of logic as well. So in order to create a situation where Syria can reclaim its own history and also establish relationships with its peaceful neighbors, we kind of have to not try to determine Syria's future. We have to be able to create the guardrails for it to create itself and stay out of the role of hegemons who want to determine its future, like Russia and Iran.
That is certainly a worthy effort, but there's always the possibility of another attack on the U.S. by terrorists. I'm thinking Twin Towers and Al Qaeda and all that remains possible. Let me go to final thoughts. Let me start with Tim. Tim, what are your final thoughts about this? Where are we going on it? Should the U.S. be concerned about preventing another attack on America? How active should the U.S. be? And what is the likelihood that we will have an enlightened government in Syria? And should we stand back completely or in part?
A lot of questions wrapped up in that. I agree wholeheartedly with Gene that the United States should not take an ethnocentric approach to any country, anywhere in the world, but particularly now with Syria. We could look at the Arab Spring, and everyone was kind of happy about that because there was a pro-democracy element to the Arab Spring. I think we shouldn't expect that, as we said earlier in the show. There was some successes, Tunisia and to some degree Egypt, but Yemen and Libya and Syria complete nightmares of civil war and destruction. We should take a wait and see attitude, proactively be supportive if asked. Keep an eye on Iran, keep an eye on Russia and Israel, keep an eye on Hezbollah. And like I said, let Syria rebuild itself in the rich culture of the Middle East, in the Arabic culture, that is really a spectacular culture. Through time, maybe we get rid of the stereotypes and the myths about Arabic culture and terrorism. That's been going on far too long, and it's time for the world to realize that Arabic culture is very rich, and get rid of these negative stereotype labels.
Manfred, your final thoughts here. We know that this is going to change the geopolitics in the region. How will it change not only Syria, but all the other countries around it and their relationships, with Europe and the US and so forth? What changes do you see? What changes do you see in the future beyond just the changes in Syria?
Well, two things. There is an incredible archive of the Assad regime's violence. They have more or less than 1 million in their record, the Commission for International Justice and Accountability. And this archive will be used, in the self-cleansing of Syria in the future. Will help the self-cleansing. Now, what I wanted to refer to one thing that Gene said about Israel's role. I do not think under the leadership of Netanyahu, we will get a somewhat more politically active Israel. But this is a chance for Israel, to play this model role in the Middle East. In a way, I think Netanyahu is not prepared for, but I think there are a lot of Israelis who are. So for that reason, Israel's role in the reconstruction of a sane, sound politics in that whole region will be very, very important.
Absolutely. Good point. Important point. We have to retain Israel's influence, but we also want Israel to be a rational force in the area. But Gene, something that Manfred mentioned, I want to follow up with you and ask you to talk about it in your final comments, and that is this. There were people in the Syrian regime who were conducting atrocities for decades. And the countries that I mentioned, who were supporting him didn't stop him. And the US didn't stop him. Presumably, the US knew through its intelligence agencies what he was doing, but it didn't stop him. And, this also goes to a question of social psychology. This kind of atrocity could happen again in any dictatorship where the dictator can get away with it. So my question for you, Gene, is what have we learned here? And how can we prevent these atrocities from happening again? Because they are really, a stain on humanity.
Well, again, I say let's start right here at home, because what we can successfully do to prevent purges and atrocities and unjust arrests and executions begins right here, right now. As we question the nature of our own institutions and our own rule of law and our own constitution, and they are being challenged as we speak with a viewpoint that is to some extent irrational and ideological, and that is that we live in a period in which there is a decline of America, there is carnage, there is violence, and we need to purge the country of these bad influences and all get into the same frame of mind and believe the same things so that we can reinstitute an orderly society. Now, that is largely imaginary, but it is believed, and if things are perceived to be real, then they are real. Secondly, you can take it from the perspective of Henry Kissinger, and I bring up Kissinger because he was what was called a foreign policy or geopolitical realist. And when you have things happening, states falling apart, civil wars, wars between states, the threat of hybrid and global war, what people want is peace, stability, and protection. So you look to realism to write the upside downness of the world. People want no violence, they want stability. They'll even believe some of these crank theories that are circulating today in the MAGA universe in order to achieve that. They will pin their hopes on a father figure like Donald Trump and hope for the best. Everyone is hoping for the best. How this plays out, though, we have to look to history and see. You always have to be on your guard when you have an autocrat who comes to power. And we have an autocrat coming to power now. So let's look now. He's already taking over, even though he hasn't taken the oath of office. So for the next 4 years, we should put our own house in order. We should decide where to resist and where to try to moderate our responses.
The price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Vigilance.
Thank you so much, Gene Rosenfeld. Thank you, Manfred Henningsen. And thank you to our co-host, Tim Apicella. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Thanks to our viewers for watching. Aloha.